Angelo Bruno was a different kind of mobster. Using his brains and his diplomacy, he would rise through the ranks of the South Philadelphia underworld. Known as the Docile Don, he was at the top of his game. But in the main streets of South Philadelphia, the seeds of treachery and betrayal had been planted. And it would end in one of the most famous mob hits ever. This is the real mob story of Angelo Bruno. Snyder Avenue in South Philadelphia. This is the site of one of the most notorious mob assassinations to have ever taken place. Number 934 was the home of Angelo Bruno, reputed mob boss of Philadelphia. A young Sicilian hood called John Stanfa sat in a parked car next to his boss, Angelo Bruno. It was here that on a rainy night, on March 21, 1980, that Angelo Bruno, the godfather of the city, would meet his end. Bruno was the victim of one of the boldest mob assassinations for years. It was an unfortunate end for a man who would rule the Philadelphia underworld with diplomacy rather than violence. Angelo Bruno was born in Villalba, Sicily in 1910 and was given the name Angelo Annaloro. He later changed Annaloro for Bruno after his paternal grandmother's surname. He arrived in the U.S. in the early 1920s, settling in South Philadelphia. He helped his father at his grocery store he ran until 1922. At the age of 12, he entered school, but only stayed in education for a few years before dropping out to open his own store at 8th and Annan Streets in Passaic Square. It was around this time that he would meet Salvatore Sabella, who was the boss of the Philadelphia criminal underworld at the time. Sabella saw potential in the young Angelo Bruno and put the young Sicilian to work in the criminal rackets under his protection. This would mark the beginning of Bruno's education in traditional mob rackets, such as bookmaking, gambling, and prostitution. During his time bootlegging liquor, Bruno became friends with a fellow Sicilian. The man was small in stature and had a distinctive hooked nose. The Sicilian hood was older than Bruno, but the two had a mutual respect for one another. They developed a close relationship, one that would serve Bruno well in the decades to come. In 1931, Bruno was officially inducted into La Cosa Nostra and became a made man in the Philadelphia family. Now a wise guy, Bruno had access to a criminal network that spanned the United States and Europe. The young, ambitious Bruno would make the most of this in the decades to follow. Around the same time, John Avina was appointed boss of Philadelphia. However, in 1936, he was shot and killed during a period of friction in the Philadelphia underworld. Joe Ida replaced him as boss up until 1959, when he decided to retire as leader and return to Sicily. He had a choice whether to make Angelo Bruno or another mobster by the name of Antonio Mr. Miggs Polina boss. He decided on Polina, a choice that would be undone in the months to follow. Polina was worried about Bruno. Bruno had the popularity amongst the men as he was well respected and a good earner. Although Bruno had no ambitions to seize power, Polina thought otherwise and decided to eliminate him. Luckily for Bruno, he'd got wind of the plan and went to seek the help of his old friend from his bootlegging days. His small hooked-nosed Sicilian friend was now a major player in the New York underworld. Through a series of Machiavellian masterstrokes, he'd risen through the ranks to take over one of the city's crime families, which now bore his name. His friend was none other than the feared Carlo Gambino. Gambino reassured Bruno that no one would make a move against him and fixed it so that Polina would step aside, allowing Bruno to take the official reins of Philadelphia. A move that now empowered Gambino, as he now had proxy control over Philadelphia. After Bruno took power, Gambino asked if Bruno needed Polina to be whacked. Bruno politely declined the offer. In a shrewd move, Bruno understood that if he murdered him, Polina loyalists would take revenge, so he opted for peace. He allowed the demoted Polina to live and continue his activities. During the 1960s and early 70s, there was relative peace in the Philadelphia underworld. Bruno expanded his operations as further afield as London, England, where he worked closely with the notorious Cray twins, Ronnie and Reggie. He was also introduced to a man by the name of Wilf Pine, an English gangster who had a close friendship with Joey Pagano, a captain in the Genovese family. Pine would regularly deliver messages between the Genovese family and Philadelphia. Pine was instrumental in being the link between the Italian-American organized crime and the criminal rackets in London. In 1976, Angelo received devastating news. His longtime friend and business partner, Carlo Gambino, had died. Before his death, Gambino appointed his nephew Paul "Big Paul" Castellano as head of the Gambino family. Bruno would maintain continuity in the close relationship with the Gambinos. The mid-1970s saw a change in culture throughout the U.S., especially with new drugs such as methamphetamine and cocaine, which were spreading in popularity. Mobsters across the country saw an opportunity to get into the lucrative markets. Philadelphia mobsters were no exception. They reveled at the thought of making huge profits. Bruno, however, had different ideas. He banned any members of the Philadelphia family to deal in narcotics. The general rule in the mob was that drugs were not permitted, as they carried heavy criminal sentences. However, not everyone followed the rules. Bruno allowed cousins of his close friend Carlo Gambino control of narcotics territory and took a slice of the profits. The double standard on drugs annoyed many members of his organization who felt that they weren't being given the opportunity to earn. Fuel was added to the fire in 1977 when Atlantic City passed a law permitting gambling. Bruno welcomed the New York families in to take a piece of the action whilst cutting out members of his own organization. South Philadelphia mobster Phil the Chicken Man Testa, the underboss of the family, was particularly unhappy. Testa was a blue-collar gangster, whereas Angelo Bruno was a racketeer and white-collar mobster. Both of them based their businesses around South Philadelphia, and they had differing opinions on how it should be run. It was the start of growing tensions between the two personalities. Bruno's grip on power started to slip. The docile Don had trouble looming elsewhere. Consigliere Antonio "Tony Bananas" Caponigro led the New Jersey faction of the organization, and he was particularly dissatisfied with Bruno's stance on narcotics. Caponigro sought to take the throne from Bruno, as he wanted to expand his narcotics operations he'd been secretly running unbeknownst to Bruno. He was being encouraged by a lieutenant of his named Ralph "Blackie" Napoli to make a bid for power against Bruno. Blackie had a strong relationship with the Genovese family through their emissary, Louis Bobby Manna, as they had both done prison time together in Garden State Correctional Facility in Yardville, New Jersey. Bobby Manna had strong influence with the top administration of the Genovese family. Blackie Napoli knew that if Caponigro made a move against Bruno, that the commission, the ruling body of the mob, would mark him for death, thus giving Blackie Napoli and the Genovese family control over lucrative North Jersey territory. The seeds of treachery had been planted. The plan began to bear fruit when Caponigro made a visit to New York to see if he had support for such a move. He met with a feared Brooklyn mob heavyweight by the name of Frank Funzi Thierry. Thierry was considered by many to be boss of the Genovese crime family at the time. However, the Genovese family was secretly controlled by a man named Vincent the Chin Gigante, a move designed to cause confusion in law enforcement circles. Caponigro explained the situation to Thierry. He told Caponigro that if anything was to happen to Bruno, that he, Caponigro, had the blessing of the commission. Meanwhile, Bruno was losing support from the Atlantic City faction of his organization. A long-time Bruno lieutenant named Nicodemo, Little Nicky Scarfo, was upset with Bruno. A year earlier, sensing there may be a power struggle between him and Phil Testa, Bruno asked Nicky who he'd side with if there was a war. Little Nicky told Bruno, "Una familia," meaning one family. He basically turned Bruno's request down. Nicky knew Bruno's enemies were lining up against him and didn't want to be on the wrong side. Months later, Bruno turned down Scarfo's request for a union contract deal to build new casinos. It was basically punishment for not having Scarfo's support in a possible intra-family war. As the new decade started, tensions were mounting on the streets of South Philadelphia. Caponigro, now with the backing of Brooklyn gangster Funzi Thierry, assembled his crew of conspirators consisting of Frank the Barracuda Sindon, John Stanfa, and brother-in-law Alfred Salerno. On the night of March 21st, 1980, Stanfa drove Bruno to his home after visiting Coos Restaurant, owned by a Caponigro lieutenant. Bruno's normal driver, Raymond Long John Martirano, was conveniently unavailable on the night. Stanfa parked the car outside of Bruno's home at the corner of 10th Street and Snyder Avenue in South Philadelphia. As the two chatted in the car, Stanfa lowered the passenger side window, allowing Bruno to discard his cigarette. It would be the last thing Bruno ever did, as it was then that a man approached the passenger side of the vehicle and blasted Bruno in his right ear with a shotgun. Bruno died instantly, and Stanfa left the scene. It was the end of the docile Don, Angelo Bruno, and the end of what would be known as a peaceful period in the Philadelphia underworld. A few weeks later, Caponigro was summoned to New York by the Genovese leadership. He thought he was going to be officially appointed the boss of Philadelphia. He was wrong. Caponigro was led down to the basement of the Triangle Social Club in Greenwich Village, Manhattan. A panel of individuals sat behind a table in a darkly lit room. There was cigar-chomping Anthony Fat Tony Salerno, Genovese emissary Bobby Manna, mob old-timer Frank Funzi Thierry, and the supreme leader of the Genovese family himself, Vincent the Chin Gigante. Gigante asked Caponigro, "We're here to find out who gave you the permission to whack out your boss, Angelo Bruno. Can you tell us?" Caponigro looked at Thierry, and Thierry shot a look back at him stone-faced. Caponigro said, "Funzi told me I had the okay, that the commission approved the hit." Gigante replied, "Frank, what's he talking about?" Thierry replied, "I told you to straighten it out, not to kill him." It was then that the penny dropped. Caponigro realized he'd been double-crossed by Thierry, and as he started to plead for his life, Genovese enforcers appeared from the shadows and started beating Caponigro to death. It was a violent end for the ambitious Caponigro. his brother-in-law Alfred Salerno, who was waiting in a nearby restaurant, was summoned to the club on the grounds that Caponegro had asked for him. He too was violently beaten to death. Their bodies would later be found in the trunk of a car, with dollar bills found stuffed into all orifices of their bodies. A Sicilian message that their greed is what got them killed. The cunning Funzi Thierry and the Genovese administration had achieved their objective of taking control of lucrative New Jersey operations and having proxy control over Philadelphia. The Philadelphia underworld would never be the same. Angelo Bruno, the docile Don, would be remembered for being a peaceful leader, one who would prefer to use non-violent methods to keep control of his family. In the final years, it was his poor judgment and inability to resolve the growing discord within his own family that would lead to his ultimate downfall.